Hello, everyone, and welcome to Common Time Podcast, where we bring you world-class professional development for music educators straight to your phone. I'm David Klemmer.
And I'm John Pasquale.
And we are your hosts and fellow music educators. In each episode, we will interview a guest who is an expert in their field, here to provide us insight, strategies, and inspiration to help you elevate your ensemble. Our guest today is composer John Mackey. John, we are so honored to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Yeah, we are absolutely looking forward to it. John, there's two Johns. Dr. Pasquale, why don't you get us started?
Yeah. Thank you, David. Hi, John. Welcome. It's an honor to be talking to you today. Thanks so much for your time. Hey, I'm just going to dive in. People know you really well. I mean, just because of the incredible music that you write. But perhaps people don't know some other things. Maybe are you able just to kind of share your journey as a composer? How did you get here? How did you become a household name in band? I mean, how did this come to be?
Well, I mean, it depends on how long you want me to make this story. Because like I can take the entire podcast and there would not be another question if you want me to just like do the whole thing. But I guess the shortest version is that I never played an instrument. That's pretty commonly known. My parents were amateur musicians, and my mother played flute and my dad played saxophone, and he played trumpet in one of the West Coast Navy bands in the 60s at Treasure Island in San Francisco. And they just, I mean, there was a piano at the house, but my parents got divorced when I was 4 and I lived with just my mom. And she still played flute in community orchestras and things, but she couldn't afford babysitters when she would go to those rehearsals when she was a single parent. And so she took me with her to every rehearsal that she had with every community orchestra, and I would sit in the back of the high school auditorium for 3 hours while they would rehearse whatever they would do that Sunday evening. And she sang in church choirs, and I would go to the church choir rehearsal. And because again, she couldn't afford a babysitter, so I was just around live music all the time, but didn't play any instruments. And because we were pretty poor, we lived in school districts that didn't really have much in the way of music classes anyway. So that's obviously one of the first things that's cut in when there are budget issues in a community is music education. So I didn't really have exposure to much in the way of music classes or anything, other than the fact that I was around live music for hours and hours every week. And then when I was 11, my grandfather got a computer. He got an Apple IIe. So now you know how old I am. And he, one day we were visiting him and he was like, "You want me to show you how to write music using this computer that I have?" And I just thought, well, it'd be really cool to see a computer. That seemed fun. So, because again, it was a different time. So we went back to the laundry room, which is where the computer was. And he showed me, how to use this music program, which you used a joystick, because this was before the mouse was it had been invented, but it wasn't. You couldn't buy a mouse. There was no such thing as a mouse in the home at that point. So you used a joystick, and you would you just drag rhythms from the bottom of the screen onto a piano stack at the top of the screen, and then you'd drag the little pointer finger to the piano icon and hit fire, and it would play what you wrote or what you had put on the staff. I wouldn't say it was writing anything, but he was, it seemed really, really fun. It was literally just, he's like, "Here's how music works. You just put the right number of beats in the measure. That's really all you have to know. The rest of the stuff can come later, and you don't even have to worry about it. But there's theory and stuff, but don't worry about that. That's all just made up stuff anyway. So, but the one rule is you have to put the right number of beats in the measure." So he's like, "Here's how you make a beat, and then 4/4 means you have 4 quarter note beats, and so have fun." And that was basically all I knew going in, and I thought it was really fun. And a couple months later, my dad got me a Commodore 64, and I used that for years. I actually still had that computer when I started undergrad. So by that point, there were much, much nicer options, but I just didn't have any money. So I still used this, early 80s computer when it was at that point, the early 90s. And so I was still using that thing when I got to undergrad. And then, basically what I was doing initially is I would sequence other composers' music into the computer for the most part. My mom eventually got a job as the secretary for the College of Music at Ohio State. Sorry, Ohio State. No, we won't talk about
we're all friends. That's okay.
That's right. We're friends here.
So she was the secretary for the College of Music, and so I would use her during the summers when I wasn't in school. I would go sometimes with her to work and use her staff ID and go to the music library and check stuff out and take it home and sequence it into the computer. And that's how I would spend all day, every day during the summer is sequencing other people's music. And and writing a little bit, but everything I was writing just sounded like bad versions of the stuff I was sequencing. So it just sounded like, really bad. Like I would try to write a fugue because I had checked out, all of these, you know, these Bach pieces. Like I put in most of like the well-tempered clavier, and I sequenced all 6 of the Bach Brandenburg concertos and a ton of organ music and stuff, because that stuff just sounds really good on a computer, which I figured out because in the early 60s, I think it was the early 60s, mid 60s, early 70s. Well, I don't know. It was before I was born. Wendy Carlos made those albums like Switched on Bach, which is Bach played on like Moog synthesizers. And I heard those as a little kid, and I was like, well, that's a computer playing Bach, so maybe I can do the same thing with my Commodore 64. So that was what I did. And initially it was much more of like sequencing other composers. And then over time, the ratio of what I was sequencing compared to what I was writing, flipped. And by the time I was probably a sophomore or so in high school, I guess I was just writing original stuff then. But it was never played by people. It was always just sequence as music software.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it all just started that way. And that's still how I do everything now. Like I depend on software to do anything. I don't have perfect pitch or anything. So I can't, if I, come up with music, like I got an idea for a middle school band piece when I had a gig a couple weeks ago. And like I write, it like looks like that when I start writing it. Like it's just a mess of like, what is even that? What is that? Someone's gonna like pause that and try to figure out exactly what that music is.
What is it? What's the next piece?
But right, so so it's a lot of it when I write a melody. If I'm not in front of the computer, is done with like the shape of the melody. Like I can know which way the pitches are going, obviously, but I don't know what the pitches are necessarily. I know the rhythms. I have good sense of rhythm, so I can transcribe rhythm accurately from what I get in my head, but not necessarily pitches and harmony and stuff like that. But yeah, it all just totally depends on software. And now I just have much nicer software, obviously, than a Commodore 64.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, yeah.
I remember the Commodore 64. So I was doing a little Google search of John Mackey before. We're bringing you on. I was like, I should brush up on what I know about John. And it's interesting. So I screenshotted it because as I'm typing John Mackey composer, I haven't finished composer yet. The second one was John Mackey composer net worth, John Mackey composer wife, John Mackey composer age, John Mackey composer, like all these are my suggestions from Google, John.
My favorite one is the net worth one, because my dad saw that at one point and he's like, you're worth like, I don't know, $50 million or something. And I'm like, I don't think that's the same John Mackey.
Well, it's gone up. It's 71 million now. I clicked and I was like,
oh, great.
What? Man,
yeah.
The
market went crazy this week, so that was probably
things changed this week for sure.
Yes, yeah.
So, it's interesting.
I don't know where they get that information. That is just the funniest thing that they think I'm worth. I really don't know where that comes from.
It was hilarious. As it popped up, I'm like, oh, this is what Google thinks I need to know.
Because there's also like there's John Mackey, who founded Whole Foods, the grocery store chain, but he's worth more than $1 billion. So it's not mixing me up with him. So I don't really know. Is it averaging us? Is that what it's like? He has 1 billion. I have 0 billion. We still should be less than So it's
it was funny to see when it popped up. I just was kind of surprised, but I was like, I have to screenshot this, so just see what's up. After I did get the actual search in, the actual questions it said people ask are, did John Mackey play an instrument? So you just mentioned that this is something that you have ideas in your head, but it goes into a software program that's creating, which leads me to a bit of a more serious question. So just as a person that's performed your music and a person that's stood in front of groups performing your music, I feel like over time your how do I say this? Like your early music had this visceral energy and exuberance, and then there was a shift at some point to something that's more introspective and kind of a calmer sense of where you're coming from. I'm just curious, was there a catalyst that created a shift in your output?
That's a good question. I think there were 2 pieces that I wrote back to back that required that. And I think the first one was the Frozen Cathedral, and then I wrote Wine Dark Sea right after the Frozen Cathedral.
Yeah.
And I think it was that order, I think. And something about the commission of Frozen Cathedral, which, for the listeners that don't know the story, is it was commissioned by John Locke, who was the director of bands at North Carolina Greensboro at the time. and he wanted a big closer for their CBDNA National Convention concert, like a big exciting closer. But he also wanted to be written in honor of his son, who had died of a drug overdose 10 years before I wrote the piece, I think. And so I needed to find a way that it could be this, exciting, like, make the people cheer kind of a piece, but also it couldn't just be that, given
Right.
the subject matter. So, and my wife Abby, we collaborate on basically everything I write. She titles everything, but and with the bigger structure pieces, we also talk about, like, if it's a programmatic piece, she comes up with the story and stuff like that. And she and I talked about what that piece could be, and she was the one who came up with the idea, because we knew that his son JP he loved camping at Denali in Alaska, and so she thought about, like, what is it about, like, the majesty of mountains that can feel like kind of transformatively healing for people. And so she's like, this was a troubled kid, but something about the mountains of Alaska made him feel safe. So she's like, why don't you think about mountains as like a secular church, basically, like a church made of ice and snow. And so that gave me the idea for the piece, and then I wrote it from there. But because I knew John Locke personally, and I knew that he was going to be conducting this piece written for his son, I couldn't just, like, I had to, like, go somewhere that felt more real, I guess, with that piece. And then the middle movement of Wine Dark Sea, I think, took that much further. And which I know, David, you conducted beautifully. And that, I think, what allowed both of those to happen was that at that point I've been writing for a band for probably 10 years or so, maybe. Yeah, because I wrote both those pieces basically when I was 40. So um, I think I was really fortunate in how my music was received over the course of that decade. And so for sure, it felt like the band community had been incredibly supportive and felt like they were going to support me whatever I wanted to try at that point. So it felt like they had given me, like, a safe space to really be emotionally honest and exposed in a piece that I wouldn't have done for the first several years. I think that's one reason why the pieces early on were so, like, I mean, I was younger, for one thing, like, but I love the visceral energy of the early pieces, for sure, and I still love writing stuff like that. But even if I had wanted to write something like that earlier in my career, I think I would have felt more uneasy about it, because, like, the way I describe it is, like, if you listen to, like, an earlier piece of mine, like Asphalt Cocktail, which is just like a loud, fast, nothing but visceral, like, rock and roll energy for 6 minutes. If you listen to that and you don't like it, I think you're an idiot. But, like,
Right.
but that's your problem. But if you listen to, like, the middle movement of Wine Dark Sea and you hate it, it's like you hate my soul. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's such a very different level of, like, emotional vulnerability to write those pieces compared to the earlier stuff.
Man.
So it wasn't that there was a specific thing that happened so much as just feeling like there were commissions that came about that needed that, and I felt like it was safe to do it at that point.
Yeah, it's incredible. That second movement of your symphony is
gorgeous.
I have distinct memories of rehearsing that piece and having to stop and be like, I have to, like, recalibrate. Like, there's a line in there where the clarinet and the oboe takes over, and I can't remember exactly where it happens, but my musicians at the time, I remember this rehearsal where they just melded those so beautifully together that it almost was like two colors came together to be a whole new color that I'd never heard before because of how they were scored. And I'd cut the ensemble off, and did anyone else hear what I just heard? What I just felt? I had to stop them. Like, it was unbelievable.
That is a trick that I stole. So another thing that happened when I was, like 10 and 11 years old, and I had to, learn to use music software, is that's also when the movie Amadeus came out. And I saw my mother, being an amateur musician, like, that was her favorite movie in the world. So, like, like, I loved that movie too, or at least I, did as much as an 11-year-old could. And there's a scene in that where Salieri is, like, going through various pieces, and he goes through the Grand Partita, and it's the Adagio from the Grand Partita, and he talks about, like, like, one of the instruments taking over for the other, and just, like, soaring above the top. And I was like, and so because it was described while it's happening in the movie, it's done so beautifully, I was like, that's a magical thing, the way those colors can shift and someone just takes over the melody and there's like a crossfade between them.
Yep.
And so I do it all the time now. And like, because of the movie Amadeus, honestly, and the Grand Partita, like, which is fun that it's a band thing, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
it
like
has historical like significance.
Exactly, right. And I would never have probably noticed it the same way if I hadn't seen it in the movie Amadeus. But like since then, yeah, there's a piece I have. Well, actually, Sheltering Sky, even like an much easier piece, does a lot of crossfades of instrument colors where it literally is crossfading, where like the clarinets will fade out while the flutes are fading in or whatever. And I just love the color shifts that you can get that way. And I started doing it or thought about doing it because of that movie.
Yeah. I appreciate that detail. That's hilarious. No, go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of made me think because of the concept that you just talked about and probably some others. I mean, we have done your music a lot and it's everywhere for outstanding reason. I mean, I've conducted it on multiple continents and it's just great. So do you have advice for ensemble conductors, how to truly bring what you're intending the audience to hear from the score? Are there any specific strategies that you are hoping that conductors truly achieve from your music?
That's a good question. I don't know. It's like the kind of thing where I can, when it's done so perfectly for me, I recognize it, but I don't know why what some conductors do feels so different. Like speaking of Sheltering Sky, years ago, Eric Wilson at Baylor had me to campus, and he was doing Wine Dark Sea, and he also was doing Sheltering Sky with the Baylor Wind Ensemble. And I don't know why he thought to put those on the same program. Like that is just not something that you see done. Like to me, Sheltering Sky is it's a pretty piece, but it's it's a 5-minute grade 3.5 or whatever. And so I'd never heard one of the best bands in the world play Sheltering Sky before. And when he did it, it was like obviously they played the whatever out of Wine Dark Sea, but the way that he did Sheltering Sky felt like this revelation to me. Like it was, I had never heard the piece, it felt like, until I heard him do it. And it was the attention to those crossfade details. And I don't know, I even kind of forgot they were in there. And people would do them, but there was something about also the ability of those players. Like this is not like you're asking even a good high school band to do this stuff. This is a tremendous band. And so they just they had the dynamic control throughout their range that they could do those crossfades regardless of where I put it in the register. And so that was really incredible. And he took so much time. So, the piece is marked really slow tempo. It's marked like 42, but no, everyone does it at 60. But like, it's
right.
I remember when I was writing it and I said it to several people, and Jeff Gershman was like, if you think this is a middle school band piece, the slowest tempo is 60 for a middle school band. There is no such thing slower than 60. And he's been mostly right. So Eric really did it really, really slow. He like stretched. I love in the slow music when people really exaggerate like a retard before a resolution. I like, Rick Clary once complained to me that I wanted my music to be conducted the way Bernstein conducts Mahler. And I was like, yeah. And Clary, but Clary's like, no, but that I would never do that, Clary said, because, that's about Bernstein, not about Mahler. And I was like, but I kind of want that sort of, really like lean into like, I love how, several conductors who do, especially my slow music really well, they really like make you wait so long for a resolution. And so much of my music has like dissonance, like a lot of dissonance. Eventually you get some resolution of it, maybe not completely, but like the release of the tension is like the whole point of what I'm trying to do. And so if you can make the audience wait almost too long for those moments, that's what I think is so special. And to have it feel organic, like it's not just, we get to the last eighth note of the bar and we basically sit there. Like, no, there's just like something about the tempo does like, it's exactly the right shape. I don't know how some conductors just really feel that. And some don't do it quite as much. I think sometimes, even when I'm there, I think maybe they're just afraid to overdo it. But to me, there's kind of, you can't like overdo. I mean, I'm sure you guys could prove me wrong, but like, I will challenge, especially young conductors. I worked with one a couple weeks ago on Sheltering Sky, and I was like, I want you to wait before the like big arrival of the final tune, when it finally happens, like, fortissimo for everybody, I want you to wait so much longer than you think is reasonable. Like, do not give me that downbeat until so much later than you think it should be. And
Right.
then it was like exactly the right place because he just didn't yet trust
Mhm.
how much was too much, I just love really, I think because the music I grew up with, like I love really like romantic era interpretations of that kind of
Sure.
stuff. Like the way Mahler is done, I love that. I love like, much earlier, I love like Chopin. Like Chopin has so much
Yeah.
rubato in it. I love that kind of treatment of music when it's not metronomic because so much of my music is metronomic anyway. When it's not, I prefer it to be like
Yeah.
really
Right.
lush to contrast that.
That
Great.
reminds me, just going back to that second movement of Wine Dark Sea, like even that little first opening, it's harp, but there's the beauty of that to me was the space between, and then it's silence. It's like you're waiting for the next thing, and then you finally get the clarinet.
Yeah.
And like with my clarinet, I remember when we were performing this, like sometimes he would rush into the resolution, like no, it's when do you do that? When do you get to that next beat?
Right.
And sometimes like, no, that's too soon. Like
Right.
there's something that it's just, there's a breath that has to go. There it is.
Yeah.
And it
And
took some
even when,
time to
sure.
bring that out of each other and developing that movement.
That reminds me of an interesting story. I don't know if it's interesting to many people, but like early on, Bob Reynolds did Hymn to a Blue Hour at Tanglewood. It was one of the first performances of Hymn to a Blue Hour. And Hymn to a Blue Hour was one of my first slow pieces, which I basically wrote on a dare from Steve Davis after he heard Asphalt Cocktail. And he was like, you can't write I bet you can't write anything slow. And it was after a CBNA concert, so I was drunk and I was like, I can write something slow for you, Steve Davis. So I'll show you, Steve Davis. So I wrote Hymn to a Blue Hour and Bob Reynolds did it at Tanglewood, and I lived in Boston at the time, and so I drove up for rehearsal, and it was excruciatingly slow. Like I couldn't believe how slow it was. And he finishes, and he like calls me up to the stage, and he's like, "So, do you have any notes?" And I said, "It's a little slow." And he's like, "I know." And I said, "But I mean, it's too slow. It's called Hymn to a Blue Hour. Like HYMN, like it's supposed to be like a singable tune, and at this tempo, if it had text, you would forget what the first words were of the line by the time we get to the end of the line if this were sung." And he says to the Tanglewood students, what you're seeing, John and I have known each other a long time. We've worked together a lot. What you're seeing here is like the kind of discussion that, composer and a conductor have about tempos and things. And even through all the time that John and I have worked together, he seems to not have recognized that as soon as he leaves, I'm doing it at my tempo.
That's
And
awesome.
so what was crazy is so then he did it faster. And I was like, okay, great. And I leave and I come back for the concert, a couple days later. And, Abby comes with me and it's the first slow tempo again. But now it works because now they have had like 3 more days of rehearsal to fill the time with the proper shaping of the phrases that he was forcing them to do, but they weren't doing yet when I was there at the early rehearsal. They were just going slow, holding these static notes. And once they knew how long they hold it, and these were good musicians. So like once they know, I'm going to hold this note for like a long time, I may as well shape it. Then it became this like beautiful, expansive performance of it that I did not know was going to happen. And he did not tell me it was going to happen like that. But so he was begrudgingly, I will say he was right. And Abby will say he was right. And Bob was sure he was right, but but it's interesting how like different tempos, it's not even just that it be faster or slower or like you extend something. It's like the players need to bring to that, this sense of like they're part of it too. It's not just the conductor like making them hold the note. Like the note has to do something while they're holding the note. And the best conductors recognize that. And even, I didn't recognize that was what he was trying to do. So.
Well, it's just interesting because my next thought and kind of where this discussion was going was really director's interpretation versus composer intent, because we do struggle with that. Like what will the composer allow us to do? Where are we off the mark? Sometimes, I mean, I've heard some things like, wow, that tempo is ridiculously wrong, but that's from, my perspective. And I'm curious, do you have, I mean, from the composer perspective, how would you suggest a director, like, how do they strike the balance between staying true to the score, but also bringing sort of their own artistic vision to your music?
Yeah, that is tough. I always think it's incredibly like I don't know if selfless is the word, but it's like generous and uh, like almost and kind of without ego for a conductor to invite a composer to a rehearsal because they don't have to do that. Like the conductor could just do it the way they think it should go. And once they invite the composer, now they're opening themselves up to someone in front of their group telling them, don't do it that way.
Yeah.
And so I always think that that's just like, I kind of forget it in the moment where I'm like telling them to fix it. But like, I am very aware that that is like a lovely, generous thing that conductor does not have to do is involve a composer in that process.
Yeah.
And it's just the newer the piece is, the less I want the tempo and stuff played with. Um, and some pieces I feel like really need to be like very specific tempos in order to work. Like the Frozen Cathedral has to be 100. There is a recording out there that people have heard because it's on an album, and it's 82, and it's terrible because it doesn't have any like lilt or dancing quality or like the motor and the brass can't play the chords long enough as at the volume they need to be at 82 that they can play basically at 100. So like that's a piece that just I think fails if it's not at the right tempo. But then you've got like Redline Tango that piece was my first band piece, so it's over 20 years old now. I at this point, I mean, I don't mean I don't care, but I kind of don't care. Like whatever the conductor does with that piece at this point, it's almost like that's not my piece anymore. It's just a piece that I really know how it goes. But like I've heard it done so many different ways. I'm open to whatever. If you do something that surprises me, great. I'm not going to be upset with anything anyone does with Redline Tango at this point. Whereas like another like when I was just at Shenandoah Conservatory last week, and they gave a great performance of Places We Can No Longer Go, which is a piece for soprano and wind ensemble that I wrote for my mother about her having dementia, and that is a piece that really has to be the tempos that it has to be. There's some temptation with some interpretations where like people want it to go slower because it's so sad. Like, no, don't slow it down even more. It's already then it just feels like a dirge if it's any slower than marked. And so that's just that is one piece that I feel like that has to be the right speed. But like, Hymn to a Blue Hour, I have in my head how I want it to go, but it's an old enough piece that I am fine with it having, more, conductor interpretive stuff. I think the faster pieces generally need to be pretty close to the marked tempo. They can't be slower than the marked tempo. And if they get much faster than the marked tempo, then they lose groove. So like Asphalt Cocktail, I think is marked like 172. It kind of needs to be 172 to really groove well. Much faster than that, and it doesn't like get dirty enough when it finally goes into like the big 4 beats.
Right. Yeah.
And it's slower than that, and it's not as flashy. So that's just like tempo specific conductor things. I mean, there are plenty of other interpretive things that they could do balance wise, and I feel like one thing I wish every conductor did, what I wish is like my notation software could like do every crescendo like this. Like I want like no crescendo and then all the crescendo at the like for so many crescendos, like I'll write a hairpin that's like 2 measures long. I want almost all the crescendo at the end, like because you really notice it that way. Unless I write like poco a poco crescendo, then that to me means like gradually get louder. But like if I do a hairpin, I kind of want every hairpin to have that little thing at the very end of it, like really like push us into where I'm trying to arrive. And that's just like
Yeah, I can see that would create an immediate effect by how that how it comes out
energetic
of the
for sure, right?
Yeah.
It helps with energy. It helps with forward motion. I mean, it's all the things, which is great.
At least, especially with like sustained crescendo. So maybe not like running your 16th. Let's have that. But if there's like two whole notes tied together and there's a hairpin on it, and we're going like piano to arrival at fortissimo, I want it piano basically until like the 3rd beat of the 2nd bar, and then I want that.
Yeah.
And then that way also you can hear all the because usually if I'm doing that, I've got other like frilly stuff happening above it or below it, and then you can still hear it while like the sustain thing is happening, and then the big, brass chord like takes over. But that's stuff that I figured out, just especially with concertos, that's necessary. Like I put all kinds of crescendos in, like, in the piece for soprano, and then I also did my clarinet concerto, and that had the same thing. Like, if you've got a brass chord that has a crescendo, a hairpin crescendo for 2 bars, it doesn't take much before you can't hear the clarinet anymore. So like, that's a really is like relatively, crescendo a little bit louder and then suddenly louder. I just need better software so I can just put that in every piece, basically.
Sure.
But like that's an interpretive thing that I wish more people would just kind of, intuitively do, so that, crescendos and things work.
Note to all of our listeners playing John Mackey's music. He just told you. Here's how
exactly
that works.
what he wants. It's exactly what he wants. So, John, just to shift us slightly from the conductor perspective to the student perspective, I think that one of the reasons why your music is so successful is that you engage with students in many ways, in person and on social media, which has been incredibly impactful and effective. So from the student perspective, do you have any advice to conductors and teachers to help students both connect with and understand the emotional intensity and the dramaticism of your music?
Oh, wow. These are good questions. I feel like I'm on Hot Wings. These are like really good questions. Wow. So what to tell teachers to help students? That's an interesting question. I don't really know that. The social media thing is an interesting thing only because it's like, it's not all composers are great at social media, obviously. And I think, the stuff that I think is, I think social media is kind of awful, but I think what's fun about it is when it can be kind of fun, when it can be just like totally honest and, open about whatever. So, like years ago when, like during lockdown, when I started like meds for ADHD, I talked about that on social media. And that was like a really big thing for kids, I think, at that time, just to find out that like, I had a therapist and I had, a doctor who like prescribed, mental health meds and stuff. I think that kind of thing can be really beneficial and make them just feel like, oh, that's a person. And so what that person is writing, is like authentic in some way about something. But I don't know what that means to like, the teacher should be like telling people to go find my social media, like, I don't know if that's, because generally, again, the social media is all like very honest. So,
well, but I just remember a student of mine one time. This was a while ago now, probably 10 years ago or so. They were so excited that they got to talk to you over social media about a question. And I forget the piece, but they're like, I'll email or DM the composer. And then you responded back and they were elated. And in that moment, I mean, it seems simple, right? But it was a profound moment for the student that probably changed their entire musical construct in their lives, right? So, I mean, it's so cool to be able to talk to a living composer. Now, those of us that are in the profession, we do this every day, right? But for students, it's really special.
It's really interesting you point that out, because I had the same thing happen yesterday the other way. Like, there's this Irish, I guess she's a pop singer, named Orla Gartland, and she was performing here in the Lower Side of Manhattan last night, and it's her first American tour. And I've been obsessed with her for a couple of years, and so I've never seen her live or anything, because no one in the States has seen her live. So I went to the concert, and she had posted something on like her story, and I responded about like, I've never been so excited for a concert, and she in my DMs replied like just OMG, and just that was like, oh my god. Or the girl responded to my DM. Oh my god!
Yep.
It's just like it takes so little when you like really admire someone to be like, oh my god, that person even saw it. Like that feels like a really amazing thing. I try to I get a lot of people do it's interesting, if someone comments something, I will generally respond back. If they DM me, I will respond back if they're not, this is going to sound awful, if they're not asking much, like if it's like, I wrote a 15-minute piece. Could I send it to you and you could give me comments and like, maybe like a lesson? I'm like, well, that's like a different thing. Like that's now you're asking for like an hour basically. And that's different than like, hey, I'm playing your whatever, like, is this the right note in this part? And I can be like, yeah, it's the right note or whatever. Like those things, quick things, I'm super happy to, engage with. And if there's someone who writes me, every once in a while I'll get a message that's like so, like sincere, says earnestly written, thoughtful note. Those like, that's not, like, will you do a thing for me? Like those,
Right.
then I will respond to.
Hmm.
But a thing that's like, do a thing. I get a lot of requests to do a thing. And so those messages I'm not as good about responding to.
Sure.
Because if I started doing the thing, then I'd be doing the thing for everybody who asked me to do the thing.
Yeah.
Like what's very sweet is when students like invite me to their graduation. Like basically every year
How
in the
sweet is
mail. I
that?
don't know how they get. I guess they get my address from like the website, but like I'll get some like a card that's like an invitation to their commencement. I'm like, someday I should go. That would just be the
That
funniest,
would be
most
hilarious.
amazing thing. But it's the interaction with the students is really, really cool. And I do see that it means a lot to them. And I think as I'm getting older, I see it more because there are more students over time who, like, when I was at Shenandoah a couple weeks ago, after the concert, someone came up like, oh, but all the students are coming up, after the concert, and one's like, so the first time I played your music, it was in 8th grade, and we played Lightning Field, and like, and I loved it. And then there's like 6 kids, and the next was like, oh, are we doing that? Okay, so the first one I played was, like, and like, and they all had their little story about like, what they had played of mine when, and it was, so cool. Or like, oh, I sent you a message or I posted a thing about you on Twitter and you liked it. And I was like, oh, I don't remember that, but great. So like,
It's meaningful to people.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I need to like, part of me, there's like a weird thing where I'm like, I don't want to like take ownership of that too much because that feels like that would make me a yucky person. If I was like,
Sure.
it's going to mean a lot to this kid if I say something, but like, because I don't want it to ever feel like that. But I also need to like remember it would mean a lot to this kid if I would say something. Like it would be.
Absolutely.
It's a nice gesture to take 30 seconds and say something. And sometimes I kind of forget that that's like just a nice human thing to do that really means a lot. So.
I mean, and it's also coming from a living composer. I remember a couple years ago, we had Frank Tekeli come to campus, and he came to work with all of the ensembles, and they came to my concert band. And I didn't anticipate any of this, but the entire horn section made shirts for Frank Tekeli's fan club. And they show up, and I'm like, I was mortified. I'm like, oh my God. And he loved
great.
it. He was like, this is the best day ever. It was really pretty special. But they had the Frank Tekeli fan club on there, so I mean, it's just being able to interact with live composers that have music that they relate to, that's impactful to them. It's emotional. It's real. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
It's really even like when I saw another concert a couple days ago in Brooklyn, and I was with Michael Markowski, another composer, and we're seeing this guitarist named Corey Wong. And before that, we went to some bakery to just like get it because I wanted a cookie. So we like went to this bakery, and we're leaving the cookie or not leaving the bakery, and there's a guy there, and he's like, John Mackey. And I was like, yes. And he said, and he said his name, and he was setting up a keyboard to do open mic night at this bakery in Brooklyn. And like, but at some point he's like, yeah, in high school, I played this piece of yours and, and you like zoomed with our band and everything. And I was like, weird. And he's like, hey, you're really nice. It's so good to see you again. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And that is honestly really, that's very cool. Like for me, that's super, cool. Like to be recognized anywhere is like, that just seems like so random. 100% of the time, it's a band kid. But like, what's amazing is how many band kids there are. There are hundreds of thousands of band kids
everywhere.
Out there.
They're everywhere, and they've all played your music. All of them.
And so that was very cool to be like, I'm in like a cool neighborhood in Brooklyn, and there's some dude setting up for open mic night, and he's like, hey, he's like, you should come back. come back for open mic night. Oh, no, we're not coming back for open mic night. But it's just like, it's the students who play in band are like the coolest thing in the world, like just how much they love it and how, genuinely, like into the music they play, and the stories behind it and anything they can learn about, the composer. But what that really comes from is from the teachers. Like I know I've learned that's 100% from the teachers. If the teachers didn't talk about the composers in those classes, then the students don't care either. It's not just that the students like the music and they go search me out on social media. It's because the teacher talks about who wrote the piece, and the teacher probably knows something about me from what I put on social media or whatever. And then the students go find stuff, and then they learn more. I think that's really what it is, because I have worked with plenty of groups where I show up and the students are not. It does not feel like a big deal to them because the teacher didn't set it up as being a big deal. It was just, oh, today we have a guest and this is the person who wrote the piece. And they're like, okay, whatever. So like, it's really interesting. It 100% comes from the podium, that excitement about like what we're playing and who wrote it, and why it's, only the person on the upper right, corner, that's who wrote this piece. And it wouldn't exist without that person. And they wrote this part that you're playing. And that's a cool thing. So like, I'm especially grateful to the teachers who make it seem like composers are cool in the first place, because we're really not. We have to be like, it's the conductors like selling us as relatively cool, I think, that makes the students think that we're cool.
Yeah. Okay, so it's just staying on the students then. I'm just curious from from your perspective as a composer, hearing your music, what's the most rewarding part of hearing students give back what you've written as a musician?
The most rewarding part? I mean, it's interesting. Like I love, like when I have a gig with a university group or whatever, high school group. I love the rehearsals. The rehearsals are by far my favorite part. The concert is generally not my favorite part. But after the concert can be really incredible, because then you talk to the students and the pressure is off and they tell you about, how special, a piece was or something. And that to me that's better than any of the rest of the trip. The concert, they can be really fun, but also, sometimes I want to leave before the concert because the concerts make me kind of nervous, honestly.
Yeah.
But the way the students are when it's done, the pressure is off. I love that interaction where they can, tell me like, oh, and sometimes it's funny because, again, this would happen like last week. Someone, they played my clarinet concerto, and one of the mallet players like holds up like this mallet part, and he's like, "What was this?" It's like this is basically unplayable. And I'm like, I know, but you nailed it. Like that was great. And he's like, well, I know, but like it was really hard. So, like,
Right.
and like that's the stuff that's super fun. Like they like that they like like are woodshedding this stuff, and then because they care, and then when they do it well, they're like, hey, you made me work on that, but it was fun. Like that's the stuff I think is really really like my favorite of the interactions that I get to have.
That's great.
Yep.
So then, John, just to change topics slightly to commissioning, because it's an important part of our field for conductors to commission composers to expand our repertoire. Do you have any suggestions or guidance for conductors in how to effectively engage in a commissioning project so that it's as easy of an experience and positive, rewarding experience as possible?
I mean, I think it's important when when a conductor reaches out to a composer, if there's stuff that's really important that it be part of the piece, that it be made clear when approaching the composer. If it's a piece, like an occasion piece, the composer should know like what the concert is going to be. If it's a piece that is, a response to something that has happened or a memorial piece or whatever, that's very important. How much needs to go into the piece. Like I've had pieces where I've turned them down because they were, this was like pre-Frozen Cathedral, pieces that were, even if someone was retiring, that it's not that I can do a retirement piece, but if they're like, this person's retiring, these were their favorite pieces. So if you could like work some of this into the piece that you write, that would be great. Like there are composers who would do that beautifully. and I just didn't feel comfortable, like I knew how to make that into a piece. So I think anything you can know before you agree to the piece, I think is essential to like put out there, whether it's, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't ask for stuff. If there's stuff that you think that you really want, this to happen within the piece, I go ahead and ask. But in general, like I prefer, for me, it to be pretty hands off. So, I want to know like the minimum that I would need to know is like if you're commissioning a piece because something happened, I want to know what happened and how long the piece is and how hard the piece should be. Like that's basically, and if there's any, specific instrumentation, and you can tell me stuff about, like, oh, our clarinets are really bad this year, like that's helpful information, honestly. And because I want, the premiere to be successful for the group that is commissioning the piece for sure. So, and it's interesting, like when Aurora Wakes premiered, the school that commissioned it was having like a not great year at that program, but the conductor didn't tell me until about a week before, or maybe 2 weeks before. So he wanted me to write what I wanted to write. And then a few weeks before, he's like, we only have 3 French horns and 2 trombones, and we have no oboes. And I was like, oh, but Aurora Wakes has all of those things. so like, but that gave me time to like make kind of a hybrid sort of version of the piece that had like a third alto sax part that covered one of the horn parts or the oboe part, depending on what was happening in the piece. So I could make like a custom version for him, but he didn't approach me to write a piece like saying, don't even include an oboe. We only have, half the horns, like stuff like that would have made it really challenging. So I, appreciate that conductor, was like, we want a good piece, but also, by the way, could you make it so we can play it? So like, as a sort of a separate, concern. So yeah, I think as much information as the conductor can give going in before the composer agrees to it. Because I've had early on, I did a piece that and it was an orchestra commission from an orchestra that never had commissioned a piece before. And I wrote it and I gave it to them, and they were like, this is fine. We were thinking something more like, and they like had some Dvorak overture they wanted to be like. And I was like, then it's a little late because the piece is done. Like you can't like, so not this, what you did, that generally doesn't go over with how the commissioning process works. Like this is another thing, like I talked about like just, how much courage I think it takes for a conductor to bring in a composer to work with in a rehearsal. But commissioning a piece, you don't know what you're going to get. Like, not every piece is a great piece from anyone. So, every composer tries to make the piece they're writing a great piece, but there are just some times that you just can't find it. Or you're just like, there's some things going on and that piece is just not as successful as everyone wanted it to be, but you still get that piece. But you might get a gem, like you just don't know. Like, how many pieces are written every year, even just for band, thousands probably. And the number that are worth playing again, they're probably not 1,000 of them. So, but, you commission and you spend the money and you don't get the money back if you don't like the piece. You got the piece. So,
So speaking of commissions, and I'm curious, we're running out of time, so I'm going to wrap this up. Do you have music that you write just for yourself? Like obviously when groups commission you or conductors commission you, and you're given something, but is there a point where you're like, I'm writing, I want to do this and I'm going to go write that? Or do you wait for commissions? How do you balance that out?
So I can think of 2 things that I've written that I wrote not knowing what they were when I wrote them. Like they weren't specifically for a commission. Or I would try to put them into a commission that I was working on at the time, and I couldn't. It just didn't work. And they're, I think, 2 of my better things. One is the middle movement of Wine Dark Sea. I wrote as just like a clarinet and piano thing initially, not the whole movement or anything, but I just wrote the tune, and I didn't know what that could be, and I put it aside. And then when I started Wine Dark Sea, very shortly after that, I was like, oh, it could be the middle movement of the symphony. And the other one is the middle movement of my clarinet concerto is another, like a more recent thing that I just wrote like 2 years ago. And that I wrote it was during lockdown, and I just came up with like this kind of, sounded to me like a French cafe, like 1930s, like Edith Piaf song or something. It had no lyrics, but I imagine if it had lyrics, they'd be in French. And I wrote this thing and I was just like, I really like this tune. I don't know what good that does me. I wrote a song. I didn't write like a piece. I wrote a song. And it just sat there, for 2 years or something. And then it was Abby and I were talking about like, waltzes and things. And I was like, oh, wait, what if I put that thing in 4/4? What if I made it a waltz? And I tried it, and it became the middle movement of the clarinet concerto. So those were two things that like I looked for something for 2 years to put that into, and it just didn't make any sense. And then finally I found it. So those are two things I just wrote as like,
Gotcha.
here's a pretty idea I have. Maybe I'll find somewhere to put that. But usually that's not what happens. Usually if I have a commission, whatever idea I get is what's going in there, because I don't have many ideas. So like, seriously, like if I could get a tune, like, well, I guess that's the tune now, because that's the only tune I got. And, at some point it just doesn't work and you have to put aside and try something else. But in general, I may waste a lot of time trying to make any idea I have in this moment work in the piece I'm writing right now, because ideas are so hard to come up with in the first place. So if I can meld it to work on the project I'm in, that's what I will do. And if I'm not writing a piece, I don't really think of music generally. There's a composer, she's a composer writer named Mary Rogers Gettle. She was the daughter of Richard Rogers, and she wrote this musical Once Upon a Mattress. But she was also the chairman of Juilliard when I was there. She was amazing. She has an incredible memoir where she talks about like when she would write music, she would write a piece and then she would finish the piece, and the ability to write music just went into cold storage. And I think that's what happens with me. If I'm not writing a piece, I don't think of music. It's really weird. It's just like I have to be like, I guess I need to write a piece. And then I like go into the mode of like trying to think of notes, but I don't like walk around and be like, oh, I came up with a tune. Like that just weirdly doesn't happen. It just I kind of like rest that muscle in my brain until I have to use it. And then it takes me a while to get it going again. But
interesting.
Yeah, I don't generally think of material unless I have to think of material.
Gotcha.
I'm fascinated by that, actually.
Yeah, I've never even thought of it being that way. Even especially the idea of cold storage. Like I need to turn that muscle off and just rest it.
Just play the new Zelda game or whatever. Like it has like nothing. Just do something that has nothing. And I listen to music recreationally for fun. Like once a week, every Sunday afternoon. That's what I generally do, is listen to music. Yeah. And that can be really informative. Where I'll like make notes about like, oh, there's a cool thing in this piece. I should think about that when I write a piece sometime. But it generally doesn't mean like if I'm not in the middle of a project, oh, I'm going to go work on it. I'm going to use that right now, because writing music is really hard, and I don't. This sounds probably weird. I don't like it. I don't generally enjoy the process because it is so difficult. Yeah. So eventually it gets to the point where it's like the most like ecstatic feeling you can imagine. Like it just like, if it's going well, I can't sit still in my chair and I'm like bouncing around, and like Abby can hear from the next room, I always write with the AirPods in because I don't want her to hear if it's bad. I don't want her to hear it yet. So I have AirPods in when I'm writing, but she can like hear from the squeaking of this chair or like how I'm breathing while I'm listening to it, if I'm like super into it. Like, but until then, it just feels miserable. It's just like so hard. And then it clicks. And like, it feels like every day is just trying to hope that it clicks that day.
Sure.
And once it does, then you hope that like will start spinning. But initially, wow, is it hard. So.
Yeah. So do you have anything upcoming? Like what's next for you?
I'm doing this middle school band thing right now that I just started like about a week ago. And I'll finish that by mid-December. That's just like a palate cleanser thing to just write. I hadn't written a young band piece for a while, and I got an idea for one, so I thought I may as well do that because I can do that pretty quickly, hopefully. And then next year, I'm writing a second symphony for a band in Switzerland.
That was my question. Actually, I have it on the screen here. Ask him about a second symphony.
Yeah, so there will be a second symphony.
Yeah.
All I know about it is that it's one band in Geneva that commissioned it, and they want like a full 30 minutes, which is the same length as Wine Dark Sea, but that's long. And what I can't really think about is Wine Dark Sea when I write it, because I think Wine Dark Sea is like one of the better things I will ever do. And so to think like, oh, let's do another one of those is like, that would be impossible. So I need to find a completely different approach on this one. So I'm not trying to just like write a less good Wine Dark Sea. It needs to be a completely different story or whatever. And Abby will help me with that, I'm sure, like she always does. And we'll talk about what a concept could be for that piece. But that's what I'll start after the new year, because that is all I will write next calendar year is that piece. So,
can't wait to hear it. Honestly,
me too.
Can't wait
me too.
I would like to have written it.
So we're wrapping up the time here. John's got one last question for you. And it's the most important.
Everybody. Yeah, it's the most important question that we ask everybody. And as a composer, I'm really curious as to the response on this one. What is your favorite time signature?
Well, the first one that came to mind was 7/8, but like that seems, I don't know. I've just always loved 7/8. I think since the first time I heard it was when I was 13 or 14, and my mom sang in a church choir, and she sang in a Unitarian church choir, which, for those who don't know what Unitarian is, it's like the most, liberal of all church possibilities. Like, if your thinking is like, there's probably God, then that's the church for you. Like, that's like about as religious as you need to be to go to, like, and even if you're like, probably not, you can still go to Unitarian church. So but what that meant is they could sing any music, and they sang the Bernstein Chichester Psalms, which the first movement is in 7. And I had never been aware of hearing music in 7 before. And I loved that first movement so much. And then I took that score home. Well, I was home because it was in a choir folder, and I sequenced that into the Commodore 64. And I just have since then always just loved the feeling of 7. And I love like 4/4 into 7 or 7/8 into 4/4, which like is what Undertow does. But I do that in several pieces because I love that feeling of just like that one extra beat that's a little bit too long. I just love the feeling of that. So it's like a really weird waltz. I love 7/8.
Yeah, Jerry Jenkins said 7/8 quickly. He's like 7/8.
He did.
That's his one.
Nice.
So
that's why he likes my music, I guess. That's probably the
probably
secret.
So well, we think that the correct answer is common time for obvious reasons, but 7/8 it's a pretty.
I messed it up.
Yeah, it's okay. We'll let you have that one. So, hey, John, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an awesome conversation.
Yeah,
really I learned a ton just listening to how you process, and I'm hoping that our listeners as well will be able to walk away with some real like actionable items. Like how do I work with his music here? How do I deal with students and that connection? And it's been really hugely informative. So thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
This was really fun. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Awesome.
John.
Okay, everyone, that's a wrap for this episode of Common Time Podcast. We hope you gained some valuable insights and inspiration to take back to your ensemble. New episodes of Common Time Podcast drop every Monday. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more music educators just like you. And a special thanks to our wives, Jessica and Teresa, for keeping us organized enough to make this happen. Also, don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media platforms at Common Time Podcasts for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Keep making music and keep making a difference.